Good day. We're going to have a look at Japanese history, the ancient period, the classical period, and then the feudal period of Japan. It refers to itself as the Empire of the Rising Sun, so I thought that was a very appropriate name for this lecture. So now let's just start first with the Japanese island, the main island of Honshu itself. Here, and I've got my arrow going around it, it is split in half in colors in this particular picture because the lower southern half that has the Yamato Plain is the region that they think was inhabited in the earliest period in which we have historical evidence called Yamato Japan, and then the northern half would later be conquered. So the evidence that we have from the earliest Japanese settlements are on the Yamato Plain and up towards Kyoto, because actually the grave sites that have been excavated are named after a Tokyo neighborhood called Yayoi, where they first discovered some of these graves of probably aristocrats in Yamato, the Yamato period, or the earliest period of Japan. So these graves rendered up lots of artifacts, and especially including armor, and that was one of the big things that were found in it. So we know that they were a warrior leading class. Also, the graves yielded evidence of belief in many gods, a polytheistic system, as we know in many other civilizations that we have: Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Greeks, the Romans, right? Shinto is the name that was given to it, and it means literally the way of the gods. The gods are representative of natural forces, which is the term kami means, right? Natural force. So most gods represent some natural force. For example, wind. So the kamikaze meant a wind or wind god, right? They personified these gods as well, not unusual. The unusual thing, I think, with the Japanese is that the aristocrats traced their family lines back to particular gods. So it was very important in the Japanese aristocratic world to have a pedigree that went back to the gods, the Shinto gods. This mythology can be found in two sources that we have from very early in Japan. One's called Record of Ancient Matters, which is mostly about the mythology and the gods. And the second one is the Record of Japan. And the Record of Japan has, in addition to tales that illustrate mythological ideas of the gods, they also have some record of the emperors as well. So those are the two earliest sources that we have of ancient Japanese history, at least that are written. Right? So we have archaeological evidence and the written source. We know, too, in this early period that the Japanese were influenced by Chinese civilization, and that's what the word Sinization means. So Sinization is to take things from Chinese culture and adapt them to Japanese culture, or anybody, but Sini means Chinese. Right? So they used Chinese models, right? For writing, they imported, in fact, Chinese symbols and Chinese words, and they have a whole collection of those words and sounds that are known as kanji today. And that's the more elaborate writing system for the Japanese. They have a second writing system that's syllabic, and today it's represented by letters as you would know them, A, B, C, D, right? And that system is called kana. The difference between the two is kind of like the difference between hieroglyphics and demonic script for the Egyptians. So they have a highly sophisticated, complex system of symbols called kanji, many of which were taken from China. And you can see the similarities in the language if you look closely at each of the symbols and compare them with Chinese. And then they have the kana, which is the It's a more common, ordinary written script, and it's syllabic, and today they use Arabic letters. They use letters, as you guys have them, actually. I think those are Phoenician. All right, they also took in from China Buddhism, and Buddhism would come into Japan and then, of course, be adapted to Japanese ways, and in fact is infused with Shinto. So you'll see in Japanese temples even today that they will do things like clap their hands to wake the gods up or to let the gods know they're there. And those are Shinto gods, and you'll see that even in Buddhist temples. They also borrow from Confucian philosophy. So all three things came in from China: Kanji, Buddhism, and Confucianism, as far as we know. All right. Classical Japan is a period that is known as the Heian and Nara periods of Japan. I have a map here that shows you the four main islands. You have the most northern one, which is Hokkaido. It's always considered sort of the most wild part of Japan. It also has the city of Sapporo, where in fact the beer is made. There's the big island, which is called Honshu here, and you can see it stretches all the way along down towards near South Korea. And then they have two smaller islands, Shikoku and Kyushu. On the main island of Honshu, we have Kyoto right here, and then Tokyo, which was earlier called Edo. And those are probably all the things that you should note on this map. The classical period is a period of the power of the emperor, and here we've written classical Japan and heavenly emperor, because the Japanese tightly bind the emperor with the notion of his religious significance, and we'll look at that in just one second. All right, so it's the Nara and Heian period. We're talking about 400 years, from 710 to halfway through the 12th century. So we've got China in its classical period, the Tang and the Song. We have the Middle East with its Muslim overlordship and the Abbasid Empire in its golden age, and we've got the Western Europe in a period of still fragmented, but the beginning of nation states, but very fragmented political power that you're going to recognize in Japan here. Reworking Chinese culture, right? They adapted even governance from China, but there are certain things that are different, so I'm going to point out the differences. Number one was they had a department of worship that was also responsible for putting in civil servants and out for checking on the resumes of civil servants, if I can put it that way. Right? Very important, and in this order: birth, who your parents were, your character, and then your capacity. And in that order, they would appoint people to be civil servants. So the civil servant class was very monitored, and family line was the most important, right? Your birth. The other thing that's a little bit different from those who worked in government and the government is just the very fact of the idea that the emperor had tenno, or the emperor was tenno itself impersonated, and that meant heavenly emperor. And that's different from China too, because it was not retractable, right? The emperor couldn't quit, and the people couldn't overthrow the emperor. And so China doesn't have quite that link between religion and the civil government. But in Japan, it was very tightly bound, right? And we call that tenno. Also, government was centered in Kyoto. This will be different from the shogunate period, when it will be centered in Edo, where the emperor took the emperor put up his residence. Like we said, it was very similar to the Chinese governance. They had a council of state, and the most important office in that council of state was the imperial household ministry. The imperial household ministry in this classical period employed 4,000 of the 6,000 Chinese civil servants. So you can see that it was very centralized. They didn't have very many civil servants out monitoring regions, etc. Right? It was all very centralized around Kyoto and the emperor himself. They did, though, have 60 governors, and there were 3 sources of power, meaning you could have 3 different positions that would give you some influence over people under you. One was you could be an auditor, and the auditors were the collectors of taxes, so they could exert lots of influence. You could be an archivist, which were the people who kept track of the laws and therefore those who were breaking and not breaking the laws. And then finally they had a police, and they too could exert influence at the very individual level, right? Kind of similar to our police today. The military was built out of, at first, conscripts that were to serve the emperor, and so the name samurai comes from that. In Japanese, samuro, means to serve itself, right? So this army, sometimes conscripted, other times volunteer, became an army of mounted warriors, which then made it very expensive, and so these mounted warriors had to be wealthy, and that made it into an elite and an aristocratic military, and therefore feudal, right, and very similar to Western Europe. Civil war was endemic. These guys were always fighting each other, another similarity to Western Europe in the feudal period. In the Narayan period, education included an education of all the Chinese models, whether it was governance, whether it was writing, whether it was poetry and literature even. In this period, though, we get that piece of literature from the earliest period that we have, and then the most extensive compilation of the text, which is called the Tale of the Genji. You guys have a reading in the Tale of Genji, and we'll have a look at it when I see you this week. It was written by Murasaki, and it's usually admired or read as to look to an understanding of the Japanese court life, and that by court we mean a social institution where aristocrats came together, or aristocratic style, aristocratic habits. Everything was about the aristocracy. You don't see much of the ordinary people in the Tale of the Genji. Right? And the Tale of Genji is a tale of Genji himself, who is an aristocrat. So it follows his life about, so it's kind of interesting in that. And it's very unlike Western novels in that it sort of follows a scenic and less confined chronology, or less confined need to make the plot make sense in time and space. Right? So Genji kind of goes about from place to place, and it picks up time when it's important to the book, and then not at other times. Right? All right. In religion, Buddhism, of course, was imported. The Japanese were most attracted to the Buddhist beliefs that required ritual practice and also had a strong moral expectation as well. Maitreya Buddhism tended to be a big draw for the Japanese, and that was the one that believed in the coming of a Messiah. In Japan, they would call it Pure Land, and I'll talk about it in just a second. They also were attracted, of course, the intellectuals to monastic sects, so there are lots of Buddhist monastic sects inside of Japan itself. And then finally, they combined Buddhism with their Shinto and polytheistic beliefs in the kami. All right, the classical period lasted all the way until the Kamakura court was established, and then this would establish what we can call here as samurai culture. Right? This picture here is the foundations of an old fort, which shows you kind of how elaborate it was. At least you can see some of the foundational work seems pretty complex, and here you're descending the stairs that go down into another part of the fort. You can see a little bit further on. These forts always sat high on a hill. They would have been built up high as well, but of wood, which is why all they have is the foundation that was in stone here. And then they were intended to be in a position so they could see anybody coming around the countryside. They often were built either on a lake or had moat-like structure around it. So just like the forts in the feudal period in Europe as well, right? There's lots of parallels between Europe and Japan. Woo, this all came up at once. Here you have a picture of on the upper right-hand side, a samurai warrior, or at least his armor. And this picture is not from the period. The one right in the middle is a picture from the 19th century of a actual samurai warrior himself in his samurai armor. Right? But in both cases you can see just how elaborate. They were made both of metal and of lacquered wood. Right? A samurai was a mounted warrior, and you can see that the sort of frightening horns and such that they had on their helmets, as well as the elaborate armor. They carried a sword that is probably the best sword in all the world that was ever created. I write here that it had a mystique, right? Well, it they say could cut somebody in half. So a samurai warrior technically should be able to take that sword and cut somebody through the middle. The Toledo sword, just so you can get a comparison, was only said to be able to lop off arms and legs. Right? So that's a pretty powerful sword. So the question is, why was it so powerful? And it was in the making process that the metal is tempered, and the more you tempered metal, the more brittle it gets. So when they make that katana sword, they put a clay across the back of it while they temper the cutting edge of it, so that they can keep the back part of the metal from being heated and made brittle. So the back becomes strong, and they can still temper and make very sharp the edge side of the sword. And so the katana is a very strong sword. Now, whether it could actually cut somebody in half or not, I don't know myself, but at least the point there is that it was a very powerful sword by their own measure. In addition, the mounted warrior here, the samurai, followed Bushido code, and that means literally the way of the warrior. It required absolute loyalty to your emperor and or your shogun. The samurai warriors were believed in the regular Shinto gods, and they were usually part of the aristocracy that traced their own family lines back to a god. And they practiced Zen Buddhism. So, like the Christian knights, these samurai warriors were also steeped in the accepted religious practices of the community. We're going to do a little comparison or look at some of the things that are different from the Christian knights themselves. Right? All right, the shogunate would be established by Yoritomo here, and he establishes what's known as, by the Japanese, a bakufu. And bakufu meant literally a tent government, because these samurai warriors, when they went out on long expeditions, took a tent with them. So they built tent establishments. And so the bakufu was the government of the shogun. And it was a military government, and the word itself indicates the military, the source of power. The Kamakura court rules Japan, and it's the first shogunate, from 1185 to 1336. The emperor is relegated to or stays in Kyoto, and the shogun, and the first shogun is Yoritomo. He will defeat other warlords that were competing for power as well, and he would set his bakufu in Edo. So the tent government was in Edo, and Edo today is called Tokyo. So don't forget that. So they put a government basically in what is Tokyo today, and that was the shogun, and he had most of the power, and he policed the Japanese region that was, conquered by him. And the emperor held his civil government, but it really didn't have much power. So Yoritomo really exercised the most political power. So it's a military government, and we call that a shogun, right? As opposed to an emperor or imperial government. The samurai, these warriors from the classical period, became the police, the justices, and the governors of Japan in this period. So under the shogun, the samurai, his warriors did everything in Japan. They were faced by the most deadly invasion they were faced by is from the Mongols. This picture here was painted of a samurai warrior here in the corner, and you can see his elaborate dress. You can see too that his horse has been hit, so I think he's going down. I'm not sure who's winning here, but the Mongol warriors are prominent here in the center. You can see the Mongols, you can see they're using crossbows. There seems to be more arrows coming from the backside of the samurai here, so perhaps it indicates, because this is a Japanese painting, and it looks to me like it's part of another painting. Anyways, here are the Mongols. Here is our Japanese samurai who seems to be going down in the fight. Right? There were two Mongol invasions in 1266 and 1281. They were both set back. 1266 they landed but left, and in 1281 they had the invasion itself was defeated by the kamikaze. And the kamikaze again is the god of the winds, and apparently a typhoon came up and destroyed the fleet before it could ever get even to Japan, and very few of them actually landed on Japanese soil. So the Japanese always saw themselves as saved by the kamikaze, and this would be the origin of the name for the warriors that would make themselves into bombs in World War II by flying airplanes, and that's how we know the name. The shogunate of the Kamakura court was ended in a period of civil war, and a warlord named Ashikage would take over. As the shogunate went on, there were more and more samurai that ended up impoverished or poor because estates were being broken up. They didn't have a policy of primogeniture, which would have given the estate of any given samurai on his death to his oldest son. Instead, estates were broken up, and some of these warriors became impoverished. Ashikage would band with many impoverished samurai and join with the emperor in a fight against other warlords. Right? This would, in addition, defeat the Kamakura court, which was north of it. So the Kamakura overlordship was then defeated by Ashikage and his samurai, who took, and I'm going to say one emperor's because there were two, an emperor's side against the Kamakura. The daimyo were continually weakened, though, by the division of the lands, and there were so many of them. They band with each other into many different military factions, right? And these military factions eventually devolved down into two. There was a northern and a southern, and Ashikage was the head of, and his clan were the head of the southern military faction that supported one of the emperors. There were two emperors that claimed right to the Japanese title as emperor. And they fought civil war until Ashikaga finally conquered the north, and then they set up a new shogunate under Ashikaga, and that shogunate would last for another 200 years into about 1500. And then just to finish off the shogunates, from 1500 to, they would last from 1500 then until 1867, when there would be a restoration of the emperor and the Meiji restoration, which we don't get into, but that's the beginning sort of a modernization of Japan. But otherwise it's under feudal overlordship. Let's take a minute out to compare it with the West. Bushido versus chivalry, just a few things. They're very similar beliefs. Loyal, you have to be brave and courageous. There's a whole shame culture that went along. And your religious views were very important also to your military loyalty. The only difference is with women and the innocent and those below them. The Bushido Code had no expectation of taking care of those who were weaker and below you, and women were not idealized in the Bushido Code, where they were in the West. Now, I realize that that doesn't mean that in reality it always turned out that way, but those were the expectations of the codes themselves. There was not a high priority placed on the care of the weak and the innocent below you, and there was no idealization under Bushido, no idealization of women under the Bushido Code. Vassalage in Bushido Code was not necessarily by kin. It often was, but not necessarily. It was much more linked to your family in the West. And also fiefs were not necessarily land. That sometimes the area that you were given control over was intended for you to collect income from the people that live there, and you weren't necessarily given a region to be overlord that really was linked with the land itself. Right? In Europe, it was always linked with land. I have a feeling it was partly because they had more land. Right? And here they have more samurai, and the samurai are doing kind of diverse jobs for the government. And so sometimes your fief or your region was merely a region where you could collect taxes or an income from the people. The civil government in Japan was in Kyoto, so there was still the concept of the emperor, even though he wasn't politically very powerful. And then there was the military government that was politically powerful in Edo. In the West, politics and civil government and military government were hand in hand always. Buddhism was a little bit different in Japan. Like I said, they followed what in China was called Maitreya, or the idea that there was a Messiah in the future coming. This was called Pure Land Buddhism in Japan. It emphasized that faith alone was important, a faith that there was a afterlife, right? A heavenly afterlife. They saw evil as the result of ignorance. It's very similar to the West. And they emphasized the importance of doing your best at things, especially jobs and marriage. And then you can see this really appealed to ordinary people, and it was practiced in large congregations. So many of the people that follow Buddhism in Japan will follow this Pure Land Buddhism. And again, the whole idea that there was a Messiah in the future to come save. Zen Buddhism is, as we said, like Chan Buddhism in China. It emphasized individual understanding the Buddha within, done through meditation. Meditation sought to return to the original mind, and that required much self-control and discipline. I'm not sure what original mind is, but that's the end of it all. They also sought intuitive understanding of things as opposed to rational, right? So you didn't need to probe something rationally. You could just have an intuitive understanding, right? They also, under Zen Buddhists, built monasteries. And many of these monasteries also became centers of art. So I'm going to leave the Japan here, and we'll leave it. That's, you guys have the Shogun, the contrast with medieval, and then a little bit on the classical period, which is the period in which the Tale of the Genji is written. So I will see you guys this week.